Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Xavier Salomon, the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator here at the Frick Collection. 2014 has truly been the El Greco year across Europe and now in the States. We celebrate this year the 400th anniversary of the death of one of the most extraordinary and inventive Renaissance artists. Born on the island of Crete in Greece, hence his nickname El Greco, the Greek, the young Domenikos Theotokopoulos traveled to Italy in the late 1560s and early 70s and spent time in Venice and in Rome before settling in Spain and making the city of Toledo his permanent home until his death in 1614. This year, 4 major exhibitions on the artist have taken place in Spain. A large monographic show last spring at the Museo de Santa Cruz in Toledo, curated by one of the most eminent El Greco scholars in the world, Fernando Marias, celebrated the painter in the city where he spent most of his life. And the show was accompanied by an itinerary throughout the city of Toledo, looking at El Greco's work still in situ. A smaller and fascinating exhibition at the Museo del Prado in Madrid, among the most interesting shows in Europe this year, by Javier Docampo and José Riello, focused on El Greco's library and the books he owned and his artistic theory based on what we know about his library and his notes on books that survive. The Prado also organized a large summer exhibition this year that looked at the relationship between El Greco and modern art, a fascinating topic. And currently, another exhibition at the Prado, curated by one of the Prado curators, Leticia Ruiz, has organized another exhibition which looks at El Greco's workshop and paintings relating to El Greco and produced after El Greco's death, which is also at the Museo de Santa Cruz in Toledo. Over this summer and this fall, the East Coast here in the States is also turning its attention to El Greco to celebrate this year. We are in the final week of our very successful exhibition, curated by the Poulet Fellow, Jong-Ho Park, Men in Armor, El Greco and Pulsone, face to face, where you will be able to see one of El Greco's masterpieces from his Roman years, the portrait of Vincenzo Anastagi, which belongs here to the Frick Collection, juxtaposed with Scipione Pulsone's marvelous portrait of Pope Gregory XIII's son, Jacopo Boncompagni, from a private collection. The show will close this Sunday. On November 4th, 3 more exhibitions devoted to El Greco will open on the same day in different cities. El Greco in the National Gallery of Art and the Washington Area Collections at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., will center on the outstanding group of works by the artist in and around Washington. El Greco in New York collections instead, at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, will group together the significant number of paintings by the artist from the Metropolitan itself, from the Lehman collection, and from the Hispanic Society. Here at the Frick, we will complement this exhibition with our own El Greco at the Frick, which will be a unique opportunity to see displayed together on a single wall in the East Gallery are 3 masterpieces by the painter, acquired by Henry Clay Frick between 1905 and 1913, the St. Jerome, the portrait of Vincenzo Anastagi, and the Purification of the Temple. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight a young and promising American scholar who has worked on El Greco for many years, Professor Andrew Casper from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Professor Casper received his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 2007 with a dissertation on El Greco and Italy, art, theory, and the religious image of the late Cinquecento. He has published widely in prominent art historical magazines, among many Apollo, Renaissance Studies, and Zeitschrift für Kunstgeschichte. And this year he has published a major book, Art and Religious Image in El Greco's Italy. Stephen Ostro, reviewing the book, has written, "The El Greco we encounter here is a highly self-conscious, ambitious, and learned painter who, by virtue of his Byzantine way of thinking, reconciled aesthetic concern with contemporary attitudes towards sacred images in the form of what Casper brilliantly terms artful icons." Professor Casper is currently working on another forthcoming book on an equally fascinating topic, The Shroud of Turin, as art, icon, and relic in early modern Italy. In this evening lecture, entitled El Greco's Italian Period and Artistic Hybridity, he will focus on the painter's decade spent between Venice and Rome, the topic of his book, analyzing it within the broader context of El Greco's entire career. I would like to remind you that the lecture tonight will be streamed live on our Frick website, and it will be available online for future viewing. I would also ask you to please turn off your cell phones. And finally, following tonight's lecture, I invite you all to view the Men in Armour exhibition in the East Gallery, which will remain open tonight until 7:30. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Casper.
Thank you, Xavier, for that very flattering introduction. Certainly it's great to see everyone here, given the horrible weather, which is always bad when I'm in New York, it turns out. And it's also great to see a mixture of familiar faces and some non-familiar faces, including former students of mine at Miami who now work in New York. So it's great to see you guys. My book, Art and the Religious Image in El Greco's Italy, published this past January, examines the early career of one of the history of art's most misunderstood figures, the Greek artist Domenico Theotokopoulos, better known as El Greco. My motivation for writing this book was a desire to broaden awareness of a period of the artist's career that is too often overlooked and dismissed when considering his position within Mediterranean art and culture of the late 1500s and early 1600s. In particular, I look at the artist's engagement with Italian art during his time spent in Venice and Rome in the late 1560s and early 1570s. This is a phase sandwiched between El Greco's beginnings as a Greek icon painter in his native Crete and his more familiar work in Spain, for which he is best known today, even 400 years after his death. In the introduction to my book, I claim that over the course of his life, El Greco's paintings underwent such drastic changes in style, patronage, and even audience that attempts to find continuity across his career risk missing the meaningful nuances of his underexplored early phase that only a focused examination can provide. In essence, this means that I avoid the larger picture. For what remains to be understood is how El Greco's Italian period fits into the conception of an artist still too often regarded as one of two things: a transplanted Greek other interloping in the West, or the artistic embodiment of Spanishness, both designations which deny the broader impact of his time in Italy on his output. The invitation to speak on occasion marking the 400th anniversary of El Greco's death in 1614 gives me the opportunity to revisit this very issue. It is my contention that El Greco's Italian period was and is more pivotal for his artistic career than what we commonly recognize. Just as we can scarcely claim to understand El Greco fully without knowing of his Greek origins, the 9-year period he spent in Venice and Rome is equally crucial to our conception of the painter and his output. But how can we as scholars and students best account for El Greco's experience in Italy in the context of his entire career? Moreover, how might the artist's Italian sojourn be reconciled with the broader 16th and 17th century Mediterranean culture in which he worked? For my talk this evening, I answer these questions with a response consisting of 3 parts. First, I will introduce the challenges posed by El Greco's engagement with Italy and Italian art that frustrate efforts to fully understand his artistic output. Second, I will propose hybridity as a model of analysis for accounting for his unique multicultural identity forged by his career moving from Greece to Italy and to Spain. I will suggest that current scholarship on hybridity that has hitherto excluded discussions of El Greco could provide the means by which we can position the artist within the larger cultural framework that nourished his career. Finally, as I will address in the third and final part of my talk, such issues may end up further complicating our jobs as art historians, especially when it comes to the attribution of paintings. My book begins with a comparison of El Greco's icon of the Dormition of the Virgin, painted around 1565 while he was still working in Crete, and the Assumption of the Virgin for the high altar of Santo Domingo el Antiguo in Toledo, completed in 1577. These paintings, both conveying episodes from the narrative of Mary's death, frame the artist's time in Italy. Their juxtaposition here thrusts his rapid stylistic metamorphosis into stark clarity. While certain features of the Assumption do reflect both El Greco's original Cretan style and his later more idiosyncratic manner, what we see is even more indicative of the impact that the intervening period in Italy exerted on his manner of pictorial representation. Over a period of only around 12 years, El Greco rejected many of the most recognizable traits characteristic of his late 16th century Cretan icons that appear in the earlier Dormition: a resplendent use of gold, precisely applied strokes of paint, flattened compositional space, sinewy figures, and others that testified to the continuing legacy of Byzantine painting. What we see in the Assumption is a style exhibiting a more thorough interest in the qualities developed by masters of the European Renaissance, evidenced most especially in the figure's volumetric form, the convincing dynamic trajectory of the Virgin's ascent upward, the coloring and illumination of the scene, and the application of paint, all qualities that El Greco seemingly adapted from versions of the subject by Titian and Tintoretto. Viewed together, it is hard to conceive of a more jarring display of dissonant styles achieved across a similar span of time at any other point of El Greco's career than what we see in the Dormition and the Assumption. Indeed, one could be forgiven for not recognizing the same hand responsible for each painting, were it not for their similar signatures, announcing the work of the artist using his formal Greek name. Domenikos Theotokopoulos displayed it on the Dormition, and a slightly more informative Domenikos Theotokopoulos of Crete displayed it, 1577, on the Assumption, which announces the work of a Greek-born artist whose origins are otherwise masked by his un-Greek style. So what happened after El Greco's visualization of Mary's Dormition that inspired him to paint the Assumption so differently just a short time later? The answer, of course, lies in a consideration of both biography and geography. As is already well known, the artist's early life was marked by persistent itinerancy. Born around 1541 in Crete, El Greco was trained as an icon painter in his hometown of Candia, today Heraklion, before moving to Venice in 1567. There he studied the art of Titian, Tintoretto, and other masters of Venetian Renaissance painting. In 1570, perhaps driven by a nagging desire to advance his self-driven tutorial on Italian Renaissance art, El Greco left Venice for Rome, where he hoped, but ultimately failed, to attract long-term patronage from Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. In 1572, he joined the local Painters Guild in Rome and almost certainly remained there for the next 4 years. During this time, we see a heightened formal influence exerted by Michelangelo, no doubt facilitated by first-hand exposure to the master's works. By 1577, El Greco settled in Spain, likely motivated by the promise of lucrative work opportunities that up to that point had eluded him. Though he did not earn the lofty appointment to the court of King Philip II that he initially desired, his vagabonding came to a sudden end when he found happier reception and more prosperous professional circumstances in the city of Toledo. After completing the espolio for the cathedral and the high altar of Santo Domingo al Antiguo, he remained in Toledo until his death in 1614. He never returned to Crete or Italy again. El Greco's itinerancy left its mark in the form of the unique pictorial development of his painting style as he evolved from Cretan icon painter, working in a largely post-Byzantine manner, to a Renaissance master who adapted with astonishing brevity to the styles of artists he admired in Italy. The third and final version of the Christ Healing the Blind from the early 1570s, now at the Galleria Nazionale in Parma, serves as a veritable depository of the artistic culture that El Greco distilled into his repertoire while working in Venice and Rome. Both the main protagonists themselves and the crowds flanking them combine figures originating in works of ancient Roman statuary and from painted narratives by Raphael and Michelangelo. El Greco positioned Christ and the young blind boy against the receding backdrop of an exaggerated perspective whose appearance here is based on an illustration for a theatrical stage set appearing first in Sebastiano Serlio's architectural treatise and later pirated by Daniele Barbaro for his treatise La Pratica della Perspettiva from 1568. This setting emerges as an experiential construct generated through the science of optics, ensnaring the viewer's active vision and thus pushing the miraculous implantation of active sight as the picture's main subject. At the terminus of this perspective construction is a view of the vaults of the baths of Diocletian, apparently copied from a woodcut in Bernardo Gamucci's Le Antichità della Città di Roma from 1569. The structure had just undergone restorative restructuring to become the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, one of Michelangelo's last architectural projects before his death. Together with oblique views of the Arch of Constantine and the columns of an unspecified temple taken from prints and drawings, these references to classical antiquity exhibit El Greco's interest in using the ruins of ancient Rome to bolster the Counter-Reformation ideology of a newly triumphant Christian church. Finally, all of these features appear in a composition bearing a style reminiscent of the shimmering color and luminosity of canvases by Venetian painters. However, as eagerly as El Greco absorbed these Italian attributes, their centrality to his painting practice suddenly diminishes after his arrival in Spain. The emphasis on the precise delineation of volumetric form and rational perspective space, as well as the deft merger of Venetian color and Central Italian design characteristic of the Italian period, eventually give way to a more recognizably El Greco style. This is marked by a flickering luminosity imparted to the representation of figures whose dematerialization of form surely appeared as strange to viewers in El Greco's time as it does to our own eyes. A closer look at El Greco's purification of the temple here at the Frick collection, shown above, will help underscore this unique stylistic metamorphosis and the problems it poses for our understanding of his artistic pedigree. What we see here, painted around 1600, is one of the last versions of a subject that El Greco painted repeatedly throughout his career. His first two versions date from his Italian period. In these, the artist situated this event in the court of a Renaissance palace with a screen of figures occupying a section of terraced steps in the front of the scenographic space. Behind them, we see an archway flanked by sculptures of Minerva and Apollo set atop a cornice in the first painting on the left, and by polished Corinthian columns in the slightly later version on the right. This opening gives way to a contemporary cityscape consisting of buildings inspired by the urban environment of 16th century Venice, a setting not unlike other large-scale narratives from around that time. I show you as an example here, Tintoretto's Christ washing the feet of his disciples, painted in 1547 for the Church of San Marcuola in Venice, now in the Prado in Madrid. This painting shows the same emphasis on figures arranged within a unified perspectival environment, delineated through architecture recessing into depth. The connection to El Greco, I hope, is fairly clear. El Greco's early versions of the purification of the temple stand out as the compositions in which he most emphatically exhibited the human body enacting a dramatic event, a characteristic enhanced by the stage-like space against which they perform. Further, in the artist's second version, above, we see how quickly El Greco developed a confidence with the design and coloring practice of Italian Renaissance painters, tightening the contours, delineating figures in space, as well as strengthening the boldness of his color and light. The influence of Renaissance masters is acknowledged through the pictorial footnote at the bottom of this painting that features portrait busts of Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and El Greco's friend Giulio Clovio, the collection of which announced El Greco's immersion into their artistic culture. Many of these traits remain in the Frick painting, whose general composition matches the two earlier versions. However, it is clear as well that El Greco moves beyond this anchoring in Italian style to a large degree. The figures maintain some three-dimensional form, but lack the precise articulation of their contours visible in works painted in Venice and Rome. They are illuminated in a less consistent fashion, with light at times appearing to emanate from within the figures themselves, lending them a shimmering immateriality. Further, the space that these figures occupy morphs into what has been called a skewed, unsettled quality. Having been first delineated so clearly in his two Italian panels, in accordance with the rules of one-point perspective that allows for a commodious environment to support the protagonists and their dramatic actions, it then collapses here into a much more shallow plane that fuses the figures together and pushes them to the front of the scene. These traits would also become the pictorial qualities that mark El Greco's mature style in Spain. By the time he completed the paintings for the high altar of the Colegio de Doña María de Aragon in Madrid between 1596 and 1600, roughly the same time as the Frick canvas, El Greco's late style emerges in its most evocative form. It is in works like these where his experience in Italy is much harder to detect, giving way to a pictorial style more suggestive of visionary apparitions than a precise rendering of terrestrial events. From where this style originated is still a matter of debate. Observers still frequently ponder whether a unique infatuation with spiritual mysticism, a debilitating astigmatism, or plain eccentricity could be responsible for distorting his perception of the world into elongated, supernatural forms, seemingly weightless bodies, erratic flashes of light and color, and spatial environments that appear at once claustrophobic and vacuous. So what exactly do these later works owe to El Greco's experience in Italy, and how do we reconcile it with the style developed in Spain? Two binary points of view taken from recent scholarship will suffice to demonstrate the difficulty in accounting for Italy after Italy. In his book, The Spanish Eye from 2007, Robert Harvard resurrects the old argument that El Greco's art in Spain is inherently Spanish and owes little to the artist's exposure to the art of Venice and Rome. He identifies the confluence of what he calls the hyperreal and superreal that equally mark such paintings as The Burial of the Count of Vergaz and contemporary mystical poetry as a national trait inflecting cultural production in Golden Age Spain. I certainly cannot deny that this new environment played some formative role in the style that El Greco developed there. However, what concerns me is Harvard's quick dismissal of El Greco's Italian period playing any role in how the artist painted afterward. Arguing that the esoteric mysticism of his paintings results from an adaptation to the Byzantine icon, he only begrudgingly acknowledges abortive attempts to master Italian Renaissance painting styles. As a result, El Greco, in Robert Harvard's words, quote, is clearly more at home in his Spanish works, once he has abandoned the geometry of tiled flooring and Italian colonnades in favor of a flatter, iconic style in which space and depth are revealed indirectly by the juxtaposition of colors and the movement, size, position of figures on the surface plane. In this view, El Greco's Spanish corpus conjures the re-emergence of his Cretan heritage, but not his more recent and still formative Italian training. While the frequent suggestion that El Greco's late style exhibits a return to the Byzantine manner in which he was originally trained certainly has some merit, the quick dismissal of his time in Venice and Rome seems rather problematic. By contrast, Marcia Hall's book, The Sacred Image in the Age of Art from 2011, avoids this problem by treating El Greco's Spanish paintings as manifestations of his Italian training imported abroad. Though describing El Greco's independence of style as one that, quote, bears only scant marks of a Venetian lineage, even less a Roman one, and only a faint echo of the Byzantine tradition, end quote, she nonetheless characterizes the environment in Toledo as one receptive to Italian-trained artists like El Greco keen on providing stimulating religious images. While certainly not all of the compositions created in Spain bear much direct or at least visibly obvious Italian influence, Hall elegantly deduces that the qualities for which El Greco's works in Spain are best known do in fact originate in Italy, as in, for example, learning from Tintoretto techniques for rendering the transcendent and deriving his brand of nocturnal illumination from Correggio. Still, as illuminating as Hall's subtle reading of El Greco's Italianisms are, it is in fact not unreasonable for viewers to downplay the influence of Italy in some of his Spanish paintings, and in others be unable to detect any visible evidence of his having been in Italy at all. We wonder how much of our probing for visible signs stems from a disbelief that his wholesale embrace of Italian Renaissance painting, which we saw earlier, could disappear as suddenly and unexpectedly as it did. What does El Greco's disavowal of the Italian style say about his identity, both ethnic and artistic? How might El Greco's choices reflect the cultural circumstances in which he was working? These questions are interrelated, and I argue that El Greco's Italian experience cannot be dismissed just because the artist moves away from the direct evocation of Titian and Michelangelo. What I propose now is a better way to understand the role of Italy for our understanding of the full arc of El Greco's career. While my book focuses on the religious meanings of El Greco's paintings to counter-Reformation artistic culture, I would like now to consider more broadly how the artist's experience working abroad and the stylistic development that ensued might reflect the environment in which he worked. In a recent article, I wrote how El Greco's signatures evince a consistent effort to maintain a public Greek identity by signing his paintings exclusively in the Greek language, no matter for whom he was working, and this remains constant throughout his career. His signatures are always and without variation in Greek at all points of his career. For Greekness apparently carried marketable prestige that the artist wished to cultivate throughout his career, even as his style diverged from that of his Cretan origins. Indeed, the issue proves especially complex when we consider the visible or stylistic legacy of his artistic training. El Greco's itinerant life and the rapid transformation of his painting style in accordance with his moves from Crete to Italy and to Spain resonate with current investigations into intercultural exchange in the early modern world. I will now explore how El Greco's artistic productivity reflects his cultural pluralism, what I will hereafter call hybridity. Though few ventured as far and for as long as he did, El Greco is certainly not the only artist who traveled during the Renaissance and Baroque period. Italy, in particular, exerted a persistent lure for artists throughout Europe, and so something of a multicultural artistic identity can be detected in works by numerous luminaries of the age. Albrecht Dürer, for example, went to Italy twice, 1494-95 and 1505-1507. Scholars have noted a distinct alteration to his style in works produced during and after his time in Italy, most especially in the Madonna of the Rose Garlands, which acts as a pictorial summary of all that he had learned in Italy. Perhaps a closer comparison to El Greco can be found in Martin van Heemskerk, whose study of a classical antiquity and Renaissance painting while in Rome in the mid-1530s contributed material to compositions for the remainder of his career in the Netherlands. Similarly, though dating a few decades after El Greco's stint in Venice and Rome, Peter Paul Rubens exhibits a stylistic absorption of Michelangelo's design, Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, and Venetian light and color, all cultivated from trips to Italy between 1600 and 1608. This is evident, for example, especially in the Raising of the Cross, now at the Antwerp Cathedral. Further, there were other Greek artists who followed similar paths to the one El Greco would take when he left Crete to work in Venice. Consider, among many others, the case of Ioannis Parmeniatis, who was active in Venice from at least the 1520s. One of his more famous works, an altarpiece of the Madonna and Child with St. John the Baptist and a holy bishop at the Museo Correre in Venice, exhibits a setting consisting of perspectival depth and a luminous landscape that are especially indicative of his absorption of local Venetian painting styles. And of course, El Greco's compatriot, Michael de Maskinos, painted works in Venice in the 1570s that display distinct Italian elements. You can see both of those qualities in both of these works shown above. But what makes El Greco's experience different is that his Italian output conceals, to my mind, more thoroughly his Greek style than what the analogous experience did the German, Flemish, and Greek manners, still somewhat visible in works by others who traveled to Italy. He developed a style that was so close to Italian models that his works bear surprisingly little evidence of his having come from a place with a different artistic tradition. In fact, we're reminded of Antonio Palomino, writing in the mid-1700s, who remarked that El Greco's paintings were often indistinguishable from those by the Venetian Renaissance master Titian. The intensity and swiftness with which El Greco adopted Italian stylistic trends during his decade-long sojourn in Venice and Rome reflects an ease with which he could adapt to local styles and traditions. And yet, scavenging for visual clues for the ingredients contributing to El Greco's artistic hybridity later in his career ends up deflecting our ability to account for the role that Italy played in the artist's development as a painter. Indeed, it has always been fashionable for scholars to search for evidence of the artist's lingering Byzantine heritage after leaving Crete in order to substantiate El Greco's inherent Greekness, even when working in the West. But the corollary consequence of such efforts is the dismissal of El Greco's Italian experience as less formative, because it is less visibly apparent in his later work. One scholar recently pronounced that Italy was, quote, an insignificant blip in El Greco's career. What I would like to address is how notions of cultural hybridity in scholarship today can help us better understand El Greco's multiculturalism generally, and in particular the impact of his Italian career both during his stay in Venice and Rome and after his departure to Spain, when his Italian style becomes a little bit less obvious. I proceed by looking at three issues. First, the extent to which El Greco's time and place could be classified as hybrid. Secondly, how El Greco is exemplary of an individual working in a hybridized culture. And thirdly, how the painter offers new insights into early modern hybridity. Peter Burke's summative essay, Cultural Hybridity, from 2009, acknowledges the prevalence of hybridity in modern scholarship. It is not hard to agree with Burke's statement that, quote, today, many of us are prepared to find hybridization almost everywhere in history. In an age of cultural globalization, historians are increasingly sensitized to similar phenomena in the past, end quote. Indeed, the extent to which hybridity does appear to be everywhere makes it all the more curious that, as far as I am aware, El Greco has not featured very prominently in any analysis of this sort, despite his prominence as an artist whose career bridged three distinct cultures of the early modern world. Granted, consideration of the artist's multicultural pedigree is at least implicit in the vast majority of studies. However, I wish to cast sharper focus and perhaps clearer light on the matter, especially given the new importance imparted to his engagement with Italian art and culture while in Italy, and my conviction that the painter's experience in Venice and Rome must be considered with equal weight as his Greek origins when trying to understand his significance to the cultures in which he worked. So what can modern notions of hybridity tell us about El Greco, and what can El Greco add to our notions of hybridity? Scholars today are increasingly sensitive to how intercultural contact engendered hybridity as a distinct facet of early modern culture, both within Europe and beyond. It could be argued that all the places where El Greco lived and worked nurtured a hybrid outlook among the many individuals who operated there. Therefore, geographic context can at least partly explain whatever hybridity we detect in his paintings. El Greco's Crete witnessed the confluence of Western and Eastern cultural forms thanks to the island's ties to the Venetian Republic at the time he was born there. As is often recognized, the nature of painting in El Greco's Crete nurtured a distinct hybridity with Italian styles of painting, a trend consistent with other Cretan icon painters of that time. In Venice itself, El Greco experienced a culture that flourished at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, which informed the city's art and material culture with distinct signs of the legacy of the Latin West, the Byzantine East, and the Islamic and Ottoman cultures of Anatolia, the Levant, and North Africa. Even Rome, though less celebrated in scholarship than Venice as a culturally pluralistic society, was a site of international pilgrimage as well as home to large numbers of foreign populations served by the Holy See. And of course, the history of Spain, Toledo included, is frequently celebrated by scholars for its fertile, multi-confessional convivencia of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultures, though scholars today rightly deny the utopian egalitarianism with which this environment is too often characterized. Yet one of the prevailing problems in scholarship on cultural hybridity of this sort is an exclusion of individual agency. Hybridity is often viewed as a broad, all-encompassing cultural phenomenon engendered by the force of cultural contact between whole societies that informed common habits of thought and practice. But looking at these issues only on a macroscopic scale often misses the more subtle nuances of how individuals negotiated these shifting and converging cultural forces. I argue that El Greco as an individual offers crucial insights for understanding artistic hybridity in the early modern Mediterranean world, centered on his pivotal experience in Venice and Rome. On one hand, he emerges as representative of the broadly entrenched dynamics of hybridity that informed his experience in Greece, Italy, and Spain from the end of the 16th to the first decades of the 17th century. But he is also anomalous. No other individual followed his exact path, and no other artist reveals the stylistic development exhibited through his artistic output. Consequently, we must be careful to distinguish between that which is broadly resonant with El Greco's time and place, and that which is unique to his own individual experience as an expatriate Cretan icon painter trained in Venice and Rome, who lived 37 years in Spain, thrice removed from his place of birth. The question we thus face is how to both quantify and qualify an individualized hybridity whose mixed ingredients might not always be so straightforwardly visible. In other words, how do we account for El Greco's career-long development as a Greek, Italian, and Spanish painter when the formal characteristics themselves might not consistently account for what contributed to his unique style? I'll get to this in a second. It is too simplistic to conclude that his late style is a simple mixture of Greek, Italian, and Spanish styles. It just can't come together to form what we see in his paintings. Instead, we might better understand the nature of El Greco's hybridity by considering the development of art and architecture in colonial Latin America that ran parallel to his artistic career. I'm certainly not suggesting that there's any direct influence, that El Greco certainly didn't go to the Spanish colonies, but that was happening at the same time. The mixing of the European and the indigenous has been the subject of studies far too numerous to recount here. But one in particular, by Carolyn Dean and Dana Liebson, does appear to be particularly useful for our efforts to gauge El Greco's artistic hybridity. In fact, the authors caution about the use of hybridity in the study of the visual culture of heterogeneous societies because of its persistent inadequacy for objectively denoting all forms of mixing. Notions of hybridity tend to distort our perception of intercultural synthesis because of an inherent assumption of the supremacy of the visible. As Dean and Liebson argue, many an object that may be the hybrid of two cultures fail to exhibit that hybridity in demonstrably visible ways. Such is the case of a Christian church designed in the European style, but utilizing native labor and even materials pirated from indigenous structures and refashioned for a new purpose. In this case, we might not detect signs of the mixing to the fullest extent that it exists. As the authors pronounce, quote, "This is the deception of visibility. It leads us to believe that unless we can see the traces of indigenous style or iconography, the cultural mixing is less significant." In a rather damning assessment of our discipline, they go on to say that, quote, "The discourse of hybridity, especially in art history, does not value the labor of art production as much as it values an object's final appearance." The implicit assumption being that if we don't see indigenous styles in a structure like this, then we might not register the contributions of the native culture to the construction of this building. Thus, art history, a field of study that necessarily takes that which is visible as its primary focus of attention, has prevented us from fully appreciating a mixed heritage that does not always reveal itself in visibly superficial ways. We have similarly struggled to articulate the role of El Greco's Italian and Greek heritage in his Spanish painting. Does the Frick purification of the temple, for example, accurately portray, in a detectable and visible manner, the contribution of El Greco's artistic training in post-Byzantine and Italian Renaissance painting? That is to say, does the fullest extent of his training and development as an artist contribute to what we see? And what of other paintings from the same time that show even less of an Italian or even Greek artistic style? I contend that even if we are unable to filter out the precise ingredients and their origins, then we can at least agree that El Greco would not have painted in the way he did had he not followed the path that he took. We should be weary of declaring El Greco's Italian experience as less significant to his later style just because it loses the close resemblance to Italian models that emerged so clearly in his work from Venice and Rome. To downplay the role of El Greco's Italian period, or to not acknowledge that El Greco went to Italy at all, would be to drastically misrepresent these paintings from his later career. And so being alert to instances of invisible hybridity will facilitate greater understanding of the relationship between El Greco's artistic background and the stylistic development of his paintings. This in turn will reveal significant choices on the part of the artist to engineer a style that reconciles the communicative and devotional goals of his paintings with the tastes and expectations of the audiences for whom he was working. But in the end, this does not make our jobs as art historians any easier. We have to admit that El Greco's style, as hybridized, visible or not, poses notable problems when determining criteria for the attribution of paintings. To admit that the artist's life and career exhibits a cultural and artistic hybridity, and that this hybridity could be manifest in invisible ways, weakens whatever firm lines we might use to demarcate the artist's own hand from that of others. I argue that the pitfalls inherent in all efforts to arrive at secure attribution are especially treacherous when considering El Greco's Italian period. This phase of his career must allow for the rapid stylistic metamorphosis from the post-Byzantine manner of his Cretan icons and the intense, focused experimentation with a range of Italian Renaissance pictorial traits. It is, in other words, more difficult to claim with absolute certainty which works are unquestionably by his hand and which ones have been or continue to be wrongly attributed because of the remarkable evolution and elasticity in style that he exhibits during his early period. If he was capable of adopting with astonishing brevity the manners of Venice and Rome, how could we define what he is not capable of doing? This problem has been a persistent one throughout the historiography of El Greco's early career, and it is especially true regarding a particularly notorious phase in El Greco scholarship from the middle of the 20th century. His presumed association by some scholars with the so-called Madonneri, or Madonna makers, provided a convenient body of work in Italy whose stylistic features could help substantiate the assumed merger of his Greek origins with the new Italian style to which he was directly exposed in Venice. These are works by anonymous artists of the Creto-Venetian school who produced cheap and stylistically heterogeneous panels of the Madonna and other religious subjects for an unsophisticated and low-paying clientele in Venice. They were thought to satisfy the demands of a populace marked by the confluence of local Venetian, hence Catholic, traditions with the Byzantine heritage that shaped so much of Venice's local identity after its colonization of Crete. As visible examples of hybridity par excellence, these images betray a clumsy adoption of Western motifs while maintaining a formal language that bears evidence of the post-Byzantine modes of icon painting out of which they emerged. Though El Greco's artistic and cultural pedigree as a Cretan-born and trained artist working alongside such painters in Venice might have made him seem a natural fit among their ranks, these artists were by and large, in the words of Harold Wethy, quote, totally unskilled, untutored, and ignorant of the very rudiments of good painting, end quote. Few today, in fact, would challenge Wethy's declaration that, quote, the attempt to transform the young El Greco into a 10th-rate vendor of small religious panels is the most regrettable development in the critical history of the artist's career, end quote. Consequently, scholars no longer entertain any notion that El Greco worked in this capacity, and certainly these are not paintings by El Greco. Truth be told, El Greco's Italian paintings exhibit a much higher proficiency with the styles of Italian Renaissance masters than what the paintings of the Madonneri typically show. And yet, these issues still linger when trying to account for the artist's transition from Crete to Venice. No less an authority than Jonathan Brown long maintained a skeptical position with regards to the attribution of what is today called the Modena triptych. Though Brown's reservations are entirely reasonable, scholarly consensus today does maintain that the Modena triptych is the earliest surviving work from El Greco's Italian period, probably painted in 1567, soon after his arrival in Venice from Crete. The ensemble's overall form is consistent with El Greco's earliest training, and this small, multi-paneled altarpiece does resemble those constructed by other Cretan icon painters around that time. Further, the style of the individual panels, despite characteristics in the handling of figure and space that is undeniably of Cretan origin, does exhibit a notable orientation towards Italian models. For instance, many of its compositional elements come from prints after Italian Renaissance works of art, and the style betrays experimentation with Italian painting practices. These, of course, would also be consistent with this stage of El Greco's career. We should also mention that this work is signed Hand of Domenicos. Once more documentation for El Greco's earlier career emerged, scholars became even more comfortable accepting this as an autograph work. But Brown remained cautious. Referring to the ensemble in his seminal survey of Spanish painting, he castigated its perceived inferior quality, arguing, quote, it is hard to accept that this brilliant, ambitious artist could have produced paintings of such poor quality. The problem really is about how to best substantiate the frequent starts and stops of a painter lurching his way westward from Crete, through Italy, and ultimately to Spain. In other words, his hybridity. Brown even admits as such, saying the issue has to do with time and geography, namely that 3 years in Venice simply was not enough time to evolve from, quote, the low level of achievement represented in the Modena triptych to a painting of the Purification of the Temple, the most ambitious work painted by the artist in Venice. As Brown's very helpful warnings indicate, El Greco's hybridity here has limitations, which serve as an impediment to understanding his early career and not so much a means to solve a problem. Other paintings still await widespread recognition, and so hover even more uneasily between acceptance and disregard. Of note, I am more comfortable than many in assigning the 4 extant panels of the so-called Ferrara triptych to El Greco's earliest years in Venice. Related to the Modena triptych in both form and style, these 4 panels once served as the wings of a complete triptych whose other components have been lost. Though ascribed to El Greco intermittently for years, it was only in a major El Greco retrospective in 1999 that an established scholar gave them serious attention. In an extensive catalog entry, Maria Konstantoudaki Kitomilidis laid out the case for attributing these panels to El Greco, largely on stylistic grounds. I remain convinced that El Greco painted these panels around the same time as the Modena triptych, within the first year or 2 of his time in Venice. However, these panels remain either ignored altogether, gently dismissed, or only tentatively accepted. Most tellingly, they were not included in El Greco's most recent catalog raisonné from 2008 by the late José Álvarez Lopera, and as a result are still relatively unrecognized. Since there is obviously no explanation for their exclusion, we cannot say for sure why they are not given more attention, especially considering both the near universal acceptance of the Modena triptych and our growing acceptance of our growing understanding of El Greco's artistic hybridity that allow for such works to be included as examples of the artist's transition from Crete to Italy. Of course, we might also question the validity of the very notion of constructing a definitive catalog raisonné for an artist who exhibited such drastic stylistic variance early in his career, before any of his works were documented that would help us secure attributions. So I ask again, where exactly do we draw the line between what El Greco was capable of early in his career and what is only reflective of his later phase, after his original Cretan training and his experimental dabbling with Italian Renaissance styles? How do we know when a painting is merely misdated as opposed to wrongly attributed, or worse, a fake? There are, of course, some limits to El Greco's hybridity that allow us to reject other paintings much more easily. To take but one example given light recently, the 2012 exhibition El Greco and Modernism included a crucifixion that Filippo Pedrocco had earlier argued should be attributed to El Greco as a modified copy after a painting by Tintoretto for the Scuola del Santissimo Sacramento in Venice. The catalog editor, Michael Schultz-Hansel, is absolutely right to be skeptical of this attribution to El Greco. The scale of the figures to the space they occupy, the nocturnal lighting, the handling of paint are much more indicative of the original attribution of this work to Tintoretto, most likely a sketch for the full-size painting. So different is it from El Greco's Italian corpus that it is hard not to think that Geoffrey Schrader was stating the case rather mildly when he remarked in a published review of the exhibition that, quote, connoisseurs likely will doubt the attribution to the master, end quote. By no means do I wish to open up a reconsideration of this painting as an example of El Greco's early engagement with Italy. However, the fact is that he was, as we know, deeply invested in studying pictorial styles by Venetian painters, no doubt Tintoretto included. Yet no painting documents his engagement with Tintoretto to the degree that we detect evidence of his study after Titian. Consequently, it would be most convenient if we could, in fact, attribute this work to El Greco's Venetian period. But even El Greco's artistic hybridity falls short of allowing this work to enter securely into his roster of early paintings. Most notorious and controversial of all is the mysterious Lady in a Fur Wrap in Glasgow, attributed by some to El Greco and dated to the late 1570s, around the time of his transition from Rome to Toledo. El Greco was known as an accomplished portraitist, and indeed nobody could doubt the quality of this particular portrait. The feathery delicacy with which the artist rendered the texture of the fur wrap, the smooth modeling of the sitter's face, and the intense yet informal gaze that serves to disarm and charm the viewer are indicative of an artistic hand of the highest order. But whether this hand was El Greco's is an entirely different matter. It is much harder to accept this as a work by the same artist responsible for painting the works previously discussed. Not surprisingly, scholars routinely criticize the painting's attribution to El Greco. The controversy became so great that the debate played out over the pages of The New Yorker and The Guardian when it was exhibited in the El Greco retrospective in New York and London in 2003-2004. and earlier this year, in fact, it was again decried a fake. Since there are surely individuals who fall on both sides of this debate, possibly even present today, I will only say that the case of the lady in a fur wrap is illustrative of the larger, more cautionary point I am trying to make about El Greco's hybridity, which I will use as a sort of conclusion to today's talk. It is undeniable that El Greco's career allowed for a kind of hybridized artistic training that bears some influence of his Greek, Italian, and Spanish output. And so considering more sensitively issues related to cultural hybridity should allow us to come to better terms with the nature by which that hybridity becomes manifest in the artist's body of work, whether it is visibly apparent or not. But as much as it opens up new and perhaps more fruitful ways to account for the fullest impact of El Greco's geographic mobility and stylistic experimentation over the course of his career, it also exposes us to further problems regarding attribution. Hybridity of the sort discussed today would seemingly allow for these works that might not look much like El Greco paintings to be attributed to him to serve as demonstrations of his experimentation with a broad range of styles around the time of his sojourn to Venice and Rome. If El Greco was a hybrid artist, where do we draw the line between El Greco's varied interests, especially in Italy, and the rightful attribution of his hand? I conclude only that hybridity is a double-edged sword. It allows us to better reconcile the inconsistent style of El Greco's career with his known biography, but it also draws out latent skepticism about the very hybrid outlook as an artist in this early phase of his career. I cannot come to any firm conclusions today, of course, but I hope that these considerations will continue to push us further into the study of this singular painter that will last at least until the next time we convene to celebrate a centenary of El Greco's death in the year 2114. Thank you.